What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran. I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. And today we're going to be talking about a BBC producer confirming that the Douma chemical weapons attack in Syria was indeed a false flag. Alexander, I think the significance of this story is not so much that it's a false flag. We've been saying this for a while now. It was pretty obvious almost the day after the attack that something was not right. This is not the first false flag hoax that has hit Syria as it pertains to chemical weapons to try and draw the U.S. to attack the Assad government. But the significance of this story to me, and you'll go into it in a lot more depth, is the fact that now you have a BBC producer saying that he can unequivocally prove without a shadow of a doubt that this was indeed a false flag. This was a hoax. Get into what's going on. The producer's name, if I'm not mistaken, is Riam Dalati. He's a reputable BBC producer. BBC, obviously, mainstream media. They're not pro-Assad. They're very anti-Assad. They're for regime change. So that's what makes this story very, very compelling. Get into it, Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, they're not just very pro-regime change, but of course they have always reported all of these chemical attacks that have happened in Syria in the past in accordance with the official Western narrative. So they have always attributed them to the Assad government. And at the time when the Douma incident was supposed to have happened, they attributed that incident to the Assad government also. Now, what this BBC producer is saying is that there was some sort of an attack on this town, on Douma, by the Syrian military. Well, that's never been disputed. He says, though, that all those extraordinary images that were shown around the world of a chemical attack being carried out on a hospital in Douma were definitely and unequivocally staged. He says he has investigated this thoroughly and that there is absolutely no doubt about it at all. Now, he's trying to leave open the possibility that there was some sort of a chlorine attack in other places, but he admits that this is still under investigation. And I have to say, frankly, I think this is extremely unlikely. The important point, the key point to get, is that we now have from a BBC producer, from, as you said, a reliable anti-Assad source, the admission that these images that we saw in the hospital were staged and that, in effect, the whole thing was manipulated. As you rightly say, this has happened before. We have been saying that was what happened in the case of Douma. Why was it exposed this time? We've again said why it was going to be exposed, which was that precisely because Douma was recaptured by the Syrian military literally hours after this incident supposedly took place, it was never possible for the terrorist groups on the ground to control the evidence and to manipulate witnesses in the way that they did on previous occasions, and that made it possible for an objective and independent and impartial investigation of the incident to take place. And now we're seeing first an admission from the OPCW, that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that there was no sarin attack on Douma, and now we have this further admission from a BBC producer that the incident was staged and manipulated in the way we've just discussed.
Yeah, that is the key point, is that the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and the Russian army got on top of it very, very quickly. They controlled the scene of the crime. And I think that's the key takeaway here. Let me read you the tweet from...
The Russians were sending...
Right, go ahead.
Yeah, within hours, the Russians were able to send military police into the area and to secure the crime scene. And that made the critical difference. After that, it became, in the end, impossible to sustain this. The official account of this, the narrative, if you like, of this incident.
Right. Let me read you Mr. Dalati's tweet, and then you can comment on it. Okay. And I quote: After almost 6 months of investigations, I can prove without a doubt that the Douma hospital scene was staged. No fatalities occurred in the hospital. All the WH, the white helmets, activists, and people I spoke to are either in Idlib or Euphrates Shield areas. Only one person was in Damascus. Alexander, elaborate a little bit more on his tweet there, what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to make one further point about this, which is that Robert Fisk, who is a very reputable British journalist, who knows the Middle East very well and is, of course, an Arabic speaker, was in Douma also within hours of the incident taking place, under, of course, the protection of the Syrian military and the Russians. And he visited this hospital, and he said at the time this incident didn't happen. And he was hugely criticized by the media, the mainstream media around the world, especially in the West, for saying that. And now, surprise, surprise, it turns out that he was right, that, as I said, we were right. I think Robert Fisk especially is owed an apology. Now, the point about what this BBC producer is saying is that he has investigated this incident thoroughly. It turns out that many of the so-called witnesses of this incident, the white helmets and all the rest, weren't even there. At least that's what the tweet seems to say. So we have a totally fabricated incident, and he's also confirmed that the Islamist terrorist group, which was in charge of Douma, was running the place with an iron fist. In other words, it was pursuing a brutal policy of controlling the area and manipulating and, frankly, terrorizing the people. That one of the doctors who was shown on all those films was an activist of this terrorist organization, and that they staged it. All the things we have always said. Now, can I remind you of something, Alex, which of course you know, which is that the Douma incident was used by the United States and by Britain and France as a pretext to launch a big missile attack on Syria. In that attack, scores of cruise missiles were launched, and of course, great amount of damage was done, and people were killed. And there was all sorts of people in the media at the time, as I very well remember, who were demanding that the attack be carried out on a far bigger scale than it was, that Russian military installations be targeted also, that a no-fly zone all across Syria be imposed. And we know that the only reason that the attack was conducted in a measured way was because the Pentagon and General Mattis, who was then the defense secretary, the US defense secretary, were concerned that carrying out an attack on that scale might lead the US into a confrontation with the Russians. So this incident was manipulated. It was misused. The evidence that it was being manipulated and misused was there right from the start. And the narrative that was constructed around it, which we now know was untrue, nearly brought the United States into a military confrontation with Russia, the other world's great nuclear power. So we should learn lessons from all of this, which is not to be manipulated in the way that Western governments and Western media were over this incident, and to wait until proper are reached, and to always act in a measured and moderate way within international law.
We're not going to learn anything over this incident.
No.
They're going to continue to manipulate. They're going to continue to go to war over false flags. The irony of all of this is that you have a BBC producer admitting as much that it was indeed a false flag and a hoax,
Yes.
but it was the BBC back then that was one of the many mainstream media channels pushing for all-out war over a false flag, pushing for the United States, for the UK, for France to protect the very people that were terrorizing citizens in Douma. They were pushing
Indeed.
for war to protect these jihadist terrorists. The white helmets. When are we going to finally admit that the white helmets is a complete hoax? When are these mainstream media channels going to admit that this was a complete hoax? To this day, Alexander, you probably still have people that are going to cite Douma as an Assad chemical weapons attack, much like Ghouta and other places that have also pretty much been confirmed to be hoaxes as well, false flags.
Well, Alex, you said lots of things, all of which I agree with. Let me just go over some of that.
That was my rant.
You're quite right. First of all, Alex, what I said should happen, you're absolutely right. It won't happen. And you want to see the proof of that? Look through the media in the West today. This report from the BBC producer, it's not being reported anywhere. It's not even being reported by the BBC. He has tweeted all of this. These are tweets. This is not on the BBC's homepage. It's not headlines on the BBC News. You don't find it in the Guardian or the Times or the Telegraph or the Washington Post
when will Twitter
or the New York Times. Indeed. Well, and apparently he is already, presumably under pressure from the BBC, or perhaps because he's concerned about the reactions of the BBC, he's already trying to restrict the circulation of his own tweet. So there you go. I mean, it's not been widely reported. And as you absolutely correctly say, despite the accumulation of evidence which we have now, of which this is, as you rightly also say, a very strong piece, that Douma incident never happened, that we're talking, in fact, not about a false flag, but about an incident that seems to have been entirely fabricated. Despite the accumulation of evidence about this, still lots and lots of people are going to continue to claim that incident did actually happen, that Assad really did do that attack, and they will continue to make claims about it and to press for more action on the basis of it. So that is the truth. That is the reality of what we're going to see. No retractions, no admissions. Donald Trump, who ordered that missile attack, is not going to turn around and say that he was deceived. Theresa May and Emmanuel Macron, who joined him, are not going to say they were deceived either. They're all going to try and kick this thing into the long grass.
It's incredible to even that you even mention the words Donald Trump and Macron and Theresa May as being deceived, when me and you, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers, from the minute this attack happened, knew in their gut that this was a complete hoax, false flag. Assad winning the war, taking back his land, about to destroy ISIS, all of a sudden decides that he's going to gas some people in order to draw the U.S. in so he could lose the war. It was such a ridiculous premise that just using the smallest amount of logic, you would not be able to be drawn into this deception. How does May and Trump and Macron actually believe this type of crap?
Right. Well, first of all, I don't know to what extent they ever did believe it. If I can come back to Donald Trump, I think he did believe it. I think Donald Trump did not have much experience at the time of what was going on. He'd already made his mind up after the very similar Khan Sheikhoun incident, about which, frankly, there are also huge doubts that Assad was some sort of monster. And I think he actually believed this really was Assad's doing at the time. I'm not sure, by the way, whether he believes that or now. It would not surprise me if one of the reasons he has been so strong about the US pullout from Syria is because he's actually figured out that he was deceived over Douma and perhaps over other things. But who knows? About Theresa May and Macron, I really am not so sure. I think that in those two cases, they are much more experienced in international politics or international affairs than Donald Trump was at that time. And I think they're more cynical about what goes on in the Middle East. And who knows, maybe they did have some understanding of what was happening. But they did it. They joined in that attack because it served their political interests. Macron is pursuing a French policy of trying to assert France's interests in Syria, which is a former French colony. And in Theresa May's case, I think there was also a political calculation in that she knew that Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, would be opposed to this attack. And I think she launched the attack because she knew that this would create divisions within Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. So I think there were all these complex agendas at work there. But the big question is not, I think, why these cynical politicians did what they did, but why they were allowed to do it. Why the media went along with it, why the parliaments, the national parliaments, supported them in doing it, why the political classes of these three countries actively assisted in an attack on a sovereign country carried out against international law, a country, moreover, defended by Russia, which is a nuclear superpower, and did so without paying any attention to the actual complete lack of any evidence that supported the pretext upon which that attack was launched. I think it says an awful lot about the terrible state of the political classes in the Western countries.
Yeah, and thank God for shows like ours. Thank God for our viewers who have the guts, the brains to understand when they're being played, when a hoax is occurring, and they're sharing, articles that are proving this hoax, and then they're telling people this is not what happened. Otherwise, if you didn't have this movement of people who really understood and who had a good feeling as to what is going on in Syria with hoaxes like this, I mean, you could really end up in a dangerous situation where you do have a potential World War III between the United States and Russia. Imagine if they imposed a no-fly zone or something like that over this incident.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what happened in Douma was a very dangerous situation, actually. I mean, we shouldn't overlook the fact that the Russians were giving warnings at the time that if there was a US attack and if it went too far, they would respond. So it was a very dangerous situation. And some of the calls that would be mobilized for military action in the West at the time of the Douma incident were, as I say, extremely ambitious. I mean, that's and extremely reckless. I mean, calling, as I said, I remember some of the reports I read at the time calling for outright no-fly zones and bombing campaigns on a huge scale, which could have easily led to an armed confrontation. And you are absolutely right. That makes it critically important that the media reports these things properly and skeptically, which is what news sites like ours were doing, mainstream media was not doing. And it is important to make that point at a time when alternative media is under such attack and where there is a clear agenda on the part of some people to close it down.
Excellent point. We will leave it at that. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Visit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt. It really helps us out a lot. And in the description box down below, you will find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Please donate to us. That also helps us out a lot. And you can get a copy of this show in audio and video format. Go to Soundcloud and iTunes and follow us there. And don't forget, go to theduran.com and see all the links that Alexander is reading every day. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of The Duran. Thank you very much. Until next time, take care.